I think with Biscuit, the movements and noises I make are involuntary.
Tourette syndrome. What is it? You may have heard and seen some crazy things about the condition.
Tourettes? How?
Butthole! Titties! Bowels! Cocksucker!
Is it really just a bunch of people uncontrollably swearing in public?
Right, yes I do. Well done. Good job.
What causes it? Who does it affect? How long does it last? How misinformed is the general public about it?
That you have Tourette syndrome and that it comes out at certain times.
In this documentary, we will meet people who live with the condition.
I have a neurological condition. What now?
People who can tell us more about it. People who have channeled it into something more powerful. And people who are using practical skills to break down their misconceptions about the condition. This is TIC. I can't believe I'm here today presenting my own documentary about Tourette's, but it's not mostly about myself. It's also about sharing the experiences of others living with Tourette's. You may have heard about Tourette's or seen people with Tourette's expressing their tics, but it's more than meets the eye. It's not just a lot of swearing. So what is Tourette's? Tourette syndrome is a medical condition that makes me and many others have uncontrollable or involuntary sounds and movements. These are called tics. I've had Tourette's since I was 9 years old. If I was asked what my goal in life is, it is TIC, the Tourette's Complex project. The project consists of 3 elements: TIC travel vlogs and blogs, TIC zine, and TIC workshops, all of which I pursue to educate about my condition and all that comes with it. This documentary is a personal journey I want to share with others. This is my way of raising more awareness about Tourette's. During this documentary, I will be travelling across the UK to interview a range of people to find what it is like for them living with Tourette's. I'll be delving into how Tourette's is different for different people and the day-to-day challenges of the condition. I will also be delivering a TIC workshop to a new group of people to let them experience what it is like to have Tourette's, and providing a chance to gather feedback about public perceptions about people like me. Before I travelled off to hear directly from my fellow tickers, I wanted to stay closer to home to find more about the condition itself. Hi, thank you for coming today and taking the nuggets here. Sorry, taking nuggets. Nuggets here. Thank you for coming today and letting me interview you. Could I get you to introduce yourself?
It's a pleasure. My name is Andrea Cavanna and I work as a consultant in behavioral neurology. I specialize
Dr. Andrea
in
Cavanna is a Tourette specialist based in the West Midlands, working as a consultant in behavioural neurology at the Birmingham and Solihull Mental Health Foundation NHS Trust.
So tics are the motor manifestations or the vocal manifestations. It's what other people see. But what people who have Tourette syndrome or other tic disorders actually experience is the subjective urge to tic. Is that feeling that's often described as a mounting inner tension or discomfort that can be relieved temporarily only by tic expression. There was a paper that was published about 10 years ago by Dr. Stern. He is a colleague who also specializes in Tourette syndrome, and the figure was 300,000 people are estimated to fulfill the diagnostic criteria for Tourette syndrome in the UK. It's important to say that this figure covers a wide range of degrees of severity. So from people who have just the minimum symptoms to fulfill the criteria for the diagnosis, which is a couple of motor tics plus at least one vocal tic since a young age, chronically, to people who have more severe presentations, the tics I mentioned, plus some complex tics, plus some behavioral problems as well.
What other treatments are there for people with TS?
There are different types of treatment. I'd say broadly we can define three treatment categories. One is behavioral treatment, one is pharmacological treatment, and one is surgical treatment. Out of the three, the one that has the most established efficacy based on the available scientific evidence is pharmacotherapy, that's medications. There are different types of medications. Some are more powerful, some are better tolerated than others. Then behavioral treatments can be specific for the tics. In that case, you need to select very carefully both the patient and the therapist who are suitable for that. And there are also CBT, cognitive behavioral techniques, that are very helpful for the underlying tic exacerbating factors, so the psychological elements that make the tics flare up. And finally, surgery is a particular type of brain surgery that's called DBS, deep brain stimulation, and that's still at pioneering stage for the more severe treatment refractory cases.
Ash is a 18-year-old who lives with Tourette's and is a nursery worker who is from Birmingham. Ash was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome at 6 years old.
Probably since I was about 4 or 5, that's when it sort of started happening, if you will, started appearing. And then, you know, it's sort of just been there that whole time, never really had a break. After about a year, obviously, like, my school started getting a bit concerned because they were like, what are you doing? So they sort of got that whole referral thing started, and then I went to the doctors about it, and obviously that whole process went through and got diagnosed when I was about 6. School was just a bit tough because I don't think anyone really understood what it was or what was going on, especially because my parents didn't really tell anyone in the school either that I was going through that, so everyone thought I was just very disruptive and things like that, and just rude because I was obviously like swearing and making noise and just disrupting everyone and everything. So it was just a very bumpy road in a sense, and I dropped out of college. So there's that. A lot of the children didn't understand at first what it was and what was going on, so it was sort of explaining it to them and explaining it to a lot of the people that I worked with as well. I think that was the main challenge for me, but daily I think it's just sort of coping with it and you know, getting through the day and making sure I don't, you know, hurt myself or a child or something. Or, you know, break a plate, because I've done that before.
Ash's workplace acknowledge and understand his condition, but others might not be so lucky.
I think at first they were very sort of weirded out and confused, and they were like, why do you do that? Like, why do you make that sound? Why do you make that movement? And obviously I explained to them that, you know, I have something called Tourette's and all of that, and explained what it was and why, like, things were happening and all sorts. And after that they just find it really funny because of the random things that you can sort of come out with, and so they just laugh along with it, and I'm like, thank God you don't take the piss. So they're really sort of supportive about it, and they really sort of help me in a sense, and so do the people that I work with as well. They also just laugh about it as well, so I'm just like, thank God you do, because otherwise it would be very awkward. What I do is that I sit them down and they're like, oh, why'd you do that? And I'm like, well, I have a thing called Tourette's, just like how so-and-so has a thing that makes him act the way he does, because obviously we work with like SEN children and we have children that have autism, and they act very differently, obviously, because when you're a child it's very hard to contain the emotions that they have, and if they don't understand them then it gets a lot harder, so they have a lot more meltdowns, and you know, so they know that so and so does this because, you know, he's upset or he's angry. So I say that I do those things because I can't help it, and there's, you know, there's a little thing in my head that just makes me do that, and just makes, you know, the words come out, or the movements happen, or the fits happen, and they're just like, oh, okay, so, you know, you're just the same. You just have a little person in your head that's doing a little dance, and I'm like, yeah. Yeah, that's how it works. And they're like, okay.
Tourette syndrome has various forms, the most common symptoms being tics. According to the NHS, these usually appear in childhood between the age of 5 and 9 and can be both physical and vocal. Although the most commonly and misrepresented form of Tourette's is swearing, an individual with Tourette's is most likely to express their tic by a number of involuntary physical actions, including blinking, eye rolling, jerking of the head or other limbs, or touching objects or other people. When it comes to vocal tics, Tourette's is more likely to present itself through grunting, throat clearing, whistling, coughing, tongue clicking, saying random words and phrases, repeating sound, word or phrase, of course, swearing. Despite its notoriety, swearing is rare and affects only about 1 in 10 people with Tourette syndrome. Overall, tics aren't usually harmful to a person's overall health, though physical tics such as jerking of the head can be painful. Tics can be worse on some days than others. Like many people with TS, my tics can be more prominent during the periods of stress, anxiety or tiredness. I'm travelling to London to meet my friend Jess, who has Tourette's and is an active educator about the condition. Jess is a writer, artist and part-time superhero who is behind some amazing inclusive projects where people are allowed to be comfortable, to make noise and to leave their seat whether they have a disability or not, and who currently helps coordinate a large play project in South London. Jess has had tics since she was a child, but wasn't diagnosed until she was in her 20s. Jess decided to turn her tics into a source of imaginative creativity, and the Tourette's Hero Project was born. Jess was the first role model I could relate to when I was younger.
Biscuit. So when I was a child, I had lots of tics, some tics, from when I was about 6. That's the earliest thing that I can identify as a tic, and it was a simple squeaking noise. Biscuit. I also jumped around a lot and made faces with my mouth and with my lips, grimaces. Biscuit. Although I had lots of unusual movements, noises, and behaviour, Biscuit, I didn't get a diagnosis of Tourette's till I was an adult. Biscuit. I did have other diagnoses, so I think I was really lucky in that my Biscuit behaviour was understood in the context of neurodiversity. Biscuit. So even though I didn't have a diagnosis, I was lucky to be generally supported and accepted and understood, both at school and by my family and by my peers. So I feel very fortunate to have had that experience. I think if my tics had been more noticeable to other people, Biscuit, then I might have got a diagnosis sooner. But actually, I knew I had Tourette's long before it was sort of official. Biscuit. But I put off getting support for a long time, partly because I thought I couldn't have Tourette's because I didn't swear at that point. Fuck it. Biscuit. And I think also it took me ages to understand what a diagnosis would add. I thought, I've gone this long without, what would that add? Actually, it was a hugely important step, because it meant that I could at last learn about something that was always a big part of my life. Biscuit. Because although my tics weren't necessarily noticeable to other people, Biscuit, I knew I behaved in an unusual way, and it would worry me a lot. And the reasons that I made up in my head that I was bad or evil, Biscuit, or that there was something really badly wrong, all of that was much worse than the reality that I had Tourette's.
Jess is a game changer in the way she thinks and views her condition. Not only that, but she allows her Tourette's to be a creative response for her artistic inspiration.
I certainly think that Tourette's gives me access to a sort of spontaneous creativity that I wouldn't have otherwise. And it took me a while to sort of understand that and value that. For a long time I saw my creativity and artistic practice is very separate from my, my identity as a disabled person. But slowly they got closer together, and I think that art and creativity is a really valuable tool for creating change and for helping people think differently about stuff that might otherwise be hard or tricky or upsetting. And actually, you can use creative spaces to challenge people in ways that. Yeah, exactly. And we made a theatre show called Backstage in Biscuitland, which was a response to a difficult experience I'd had at a theatre where I'd been asked to move and sit separately because of my tics, despite having done loads of preparation in advance and being introduced to the audience. So we'd done all of this prep, and it was still a really distressing and humiliating experience. And my initial response was just to promise myself that I would never set foot in another theatre again. But luckily I didn't keep that promise, and instead I was supported to understand that I could occupy the only seat in the house I wouldn't be asked to leave, on stage. And we made a show about Tourette's, about my experience with Tourette's, but also about theatre itself. And I sort of passionately believe that if you make art accessible, then you make it better art, you enrich it, it gives it depth that it wouldn't otherwise have.
Jess has been a constant inspiration for me and many others in reminding those with Tourette's that the neurological condition isn't an obstacle in following your ambitions and dreams. Educating and raising awareness about Tourette's has become a key aspect of my activism and is present in much of what I do now. Back in Birmingham, I am holding a workshop to help people understand the condition. I have set up a high-energy exercise for participants to help them understand the intensity of physical demanding actions that often come with Tourette syndrome. By getting them to engage in vocal and physical activity, I'm hoping they understand the challenge of having and managing tics that are often involuntary and highly strenuous.
When did you first realise that there was something different going on?
For treatments, what I'm aware of is there's different treatment, like medication. I'm not a specialist to say what you take and do. Obviously, I'm on medication, so that's one form. The CBD, or some cognitive behaviour therapy, but for Tourette's.
Okay.
Raising awareness hasn't always come naturally to me. Growing up, I've always been very conscious about my Tourette's and my tics, often resulting in a lot of anxiety and stress. But people like Jess have inspired me to go beyond and use my condition as a means of self-empowerment. Like me, Spencer has also met and been inspired by Jess. Spencer's a teenager from Oxfordshire who lives with Tourette's. He's currently at secondary school, but outside of that, he's a black belt in Jeet Kune Do and he's a qualified junior instructor in the martial art.
I started ticking when I was 6 years old, so 8 years, but I was diagnosed when I was 7. It took me a year to get diagnosed with Tourette's because they do tests over a year because you have to have a certain amount of vocal and motor tics before you get diagnosed. It took me a long time, probably because we didn't know what was going on with my body at all. I come home after a stressful night and I started sniffing and snorting, and I didn't know what was going on at all. We thought it might have been something that just happened in that night, and then the next morning it continued, so I didn't know what was going on. So it took quite a bit, took quite a lot of research to get to where we are now and getting diagnosed.
Spencer's Tourette started when he was 7. Now in his teens, he's already raising a lot of Tourette's awareness at his school by delivering presentations in his lessons. A Channel 4 documentary exploring his condition was broadcasted in 2018. I recall the struggle of being at school while having Tourette's, so I wanted to know more about Spencer's personal perspective of living with Tourette's at his age.
A lot of the time I try and suppress my tics because a lot of people don't accept Tourette's and what Tourette's brings with it, and a lot of people joke around about it. So if I start ticking, I'm going to get picked on a little bit because I'm an easy target to get picked on. Even when I don't tick in school, I get in school or out and about, I still can get picked on because people just don't understand it, and or they don't want to understand it because it's a hard thing to get your head around. I personally believe the younger the child, the more understanding they are, because they've not been shaped by social media, or they wouldn't have heard Mickey taking or bad things like that about Tourette's. So I believe if you taught them about Tourette's young and disabilities young, they're going to grow up and not take effect from the like joking around about it, or the on social media when people take Mickey out of it, that they're not going to take that in and think, oh, that's funny. They're going to think that's not funny at all.
Meeting Spencer took me back to my school days and reminded me how difficult it was having the condition in a world where most people don't, where most people see it as something abnormal, where a lot of people perceive it as a mental health problem rather than a neurological condition. He also inspired me as a reminder that despite the struggles of living with Tourette's, it's been possible for people like me to live a productive and progressive life, often pushing out boundaries to do more. Returning to Birmingham, I've reflected on how much of an impact educating people about Tourette's actually has. And I do really feel there's a long way to go. People like Ash, Jess, Spencer and myself are hopefully having an impact. So what have we learned? Tourette syndrome is a complex medical condition, often misunderstood as just swearing.
I think I got Tourette's bumhole syndrome.
Well, that's not the case. There's a lot more to it.
So the most common comorbid conditions in people who have diagnosis of Tourette syndrome are obsessive-compulsive disorder of a specific kind, which is often called the tic-related OCD. And the other one is ADHD, which stands for attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. That's mainly present in children who have tics. And there are also other conditions that are frequently seen in people who have tics. These include affective disorders, anxiety and autism spectrum disorders, as well as a degree of impulsivity. So when people talk about Tourette syndrome, also in the media, there's often a focus on a particular complex vocal tic, which is the swearing tic. In medical terms, it's called coprolalia.
Ass!
Possible Tourette's?
But that's a biased portrayal of the condition, because that's not an essential feature of any tic disorder. So it's not required for the diagnosis of
It's
Tourette.
not just understanding the medical implications of Tourette's, but also challenging its reduction to simple stereotype.
So I think Tourette's is a condition where there are lots of myths and stereotypes, and lots of people have heard of it, but most of what they know is based on rubbish. And so I think the biggest myths are, there's obviously the myths around swearing and people just thinking about it as a swearing disease. Obscene tics, and even non-obscene but socially inappropriate behaviour can be a part of lots of people's experiences of Tourette's. Hedgehog, but the sort of myths that that's all there is to it and that it's just the swearing disease gets in the way of people getting support. I think another big myth, is that it's just saying what's on your mind. I promise I don't think about biscuits nearly as much as I talk about them. Sausage. So I think that idea that people with Tourette's are just saying what they're thinking, and therefore tics always have some sort of basis in truth can be really damaging and upsetting. It is not our job as people with Tourette's or as disabled people to do all the educating. It's like we should be able to choose to do as much of that as we want. We shouldn't have to answer questions. Biscuit, in my experience, actually talking about tics and having the confidence and language to explain them to other people has had a more powerful impact than any other sort of intervention or treatment. And it's the thing that keeps me safe, it's the thing that gives me a good quality of life, it's the thing that means that I can ask for support when I require it. So Biscuit, I always say to anyone who has Tourette's or who is raising a child with Tourette's, developing sort of language and not just copying or mimicking other people's language around Tourette's and how they explain it, but really trying to understand what their tics feel like or what support they need, because it's very different person to person.
Tourette's is like a cough or a sneeze. It isn't contagious like some people think.
Jessie's right. We are more than just stereotypes and comedy value on TV shows. We need to keep fighting for better representation so people see us more than just a medical condition, so that we have fairer representation of who we are. So, what should we do going forward? How do we change the way we perceive those with Tourette's while also changing the way those with Tourette's perceive themselves?
In a perfect universe, I would love to tic freely without repression, but at the end of the day, it's unrealistic in today's society. Many of us often find ourselves moulding into how society wants us or how social norms suggest.
Along my journey, I have met some incredible people who have been open and kind enough to share their personal experience, struggles and knowledge about living with their Tourette's. These inspiring individuals have made me think hard too about how Tourette's is different from person to person, but also how much we have in common and how these similarities unite us in our journey moving forward. It may be just a small step on my path to raise awareness about Tourette's, but I hope everyone that has watched this documentary is more aware of what it is like to have the condition.
And a bonus if they've learnt something new to help them fight the stigma associated with Tourette syndrome.